Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Kiana and I do a lot of sewing and fashion videos, and today I have a tutorial for this square neck V-waist dress. I'm really excited about this pattern today because it is beginner friendly and y'all have been asking me for more beginner friendly patterns. If the dress looks familiar, it's because I actually used this pattern for the dress I wore at the Bridgerton premiere red carpet in London. I just modified the pattern a little bit to add boning and a big bow on the back, but that is this exact pattern. If you want to see the process of me making that red carpet dress, I'll link it at the top of the screen and down below. I'll also have the pattern to this dress as the first link down below, and this dress really makes me feel like a princess, so you can use the code PRINCESS for 30% off until tomorrow at midnight Eastern time. You can also find all the supplies and materials needed to make this dress in that first link down below in the pattern listing description, and I'll have all the equipment that I used throughout this video down in the video description. Alright, so without further ado, let's just get into the tutorial. Alright, so start off by printing out your pattern at 100% scale and make sure you're paying attention to the disclaimer on page 1 of your print file because it tells you what pages you actually need to print. Then just line up your pieces of paper edge to edge without overlapping or trimming, and use the lettered and numbered diamonds to tape everything together. Then check the instruction pamphlet to figure out your size and cut on the corresponding line. For reference, I'm cutting out a US size 0. Now moving on to sewing, I'm going to start off with the front bodice shell pieces. Place them right sides together along the princess seams, pin, and then sew. And disclaimer, because this is a fully lined bodice, I am not serging my pieces. However, if you are using fabric that frays really easily, then I would recommend before sewing the bodice, serging around all of your pieces and then proceeding with the sewing. Now just make some notches around the bust area and the seam allowance so that everything presses nice and flat. And this is important. For the princess seams, you're going to press them inwards towards the center of your body. You can't press these open, you can't press them to the side, you have to press them inwards. Now moving on to the back bodice shell, again we're going to place those right sides together along the princess seams, pin, and then sew. And then again, you need to press these seams inwards towards the center of the body. Now place the back bodice pieces right sides together with the front bodice and pin and sew along the side seams and shoulder seams. Then press these seams open. Now repeat all of those steps for the lining bodice. Moving on to the skirt, we are going to start by finishing the edges, the side seam edges of both the shell and the lining pieces by serging. Then we can take the skirt shell, place them right sides together at the side seams, sew, and press open. And you're going to repeat that process for the skirt lining. Now we're going to gather the skirt shell pieces by sewing 2 rows of basting stitches in the seam allowance of the shell without back stitching. I also think it's easier if you sew from the side seam to the center and then from the center to the side seam. Sew in 2 separate stitches so that you can pull each side of the skirt independently. And to sew a basting stitch, just lengthen your stitch length to the longest setting on your sewing machine. Now to create the gathers, you're going to pull on the bobbin threads of your basting stitches until the skirt waistline gathers up to fit the measurement of the bodice waistline. Then you can pin the skirt to the bodice right sides together. Then just sew and serge this seam. I also think that this seam is a little bit easier to sew than the lining seam because that point can be a little bit tricky to sew, but with the gathers, it does kind of hide that and make it a lot easier. So here is how I do the lining waistline seam. This skirt is not gathered, so again, it is a little bit trickier. So I like to mark out exactly where my stitch line is on both the skirt piece and the bodice piece at that center point so that when I'm sewing the seam, I don't get confused. So pin the bodice and the skirt lining pieces right sides together and sew. When you get to that center point, you're going to have to lower your needle, raise your presser foot, and pivot the fabric so you can sew down the other side of the skirt. Also, if you find it hard to pivot at the center point, you can use some scissors to clip in to the seam allowance at the center point, just to let the fabric open up a little bit and be easier to maneuver. Also, this is the hardest part of this dress. This is a pretty beginner dress, and this is the hardest seam right here. So just take your time, go slowly. It took me a good couple of minutes to maneuver around this center point. So just take it slow if you're a beginner, and also realize that this is the lining. So if it doesn't turn out perfect, nobody's gonna know. Now just serge the seam to finish it. Then go ahead and press your 2 waistline seams. I find that the shell wants to be pressed upwards, that waistline seam wants to be pressed upwards, and then I find that the lining waistline seam wants to be pressed downwards, but you can really press them either way. Now it's time to prep for our invisible zipper. So to prep for that, serge the center back seams of the dress independently of each other, and then install the invisible zipper. So if you know how to install an invisible zipper, go ahead and do that. And if not, I'm going to walk you through my favorite little tips and tricks with an invisible zipper. So first off, make sure that little plastic zipper pull is about 5/8 away from the neckline. Make sure your zipper is unzipped and pin just one side of your zipper to the right side of your dress. Then I like to sew a basting stitch in. Then before sewing the other side, I like to zip my zipper back up, place a pin at the waistline seam on the other side of the zipper, and then the same thing for where the zipper stops. Unzip my zipper, flip that over to the other side of the dress and pin those in place. That way you know when you zip the zipper back up after sewing, everything is going to line up. Then again, I'm just going to sew a basting stitch on this side of the zipper before I zip it back up. Make sure everything lines up correctly, and then sewing that in place with either a zipper foot or an invisible zipper foot permanently. Then just finish that center back seam by sewing the skirt closed from where the zipper ends down to the hem. And then press the seam open and clip off the excess zipper. But make sure your zipper is zipped closed first. Now unzip your zipper and take the shell and the lining pieces and place them right sides together along the neckline and down the center back seam where the zipper is, and pin everything in place. You're gonna sew from where the zipper stop is up to the neckline along that center back seam with 1/4 inch seam allowance, then pivot and sew along the neckline with 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then again pivot and sew down the other side of that center back seam where the zipper is with 1/4 inch seam allowance. Also be careful of where the princess seams are. You want to make sure that when you pin and sew, you're fully enclosing those seams into the seam allowance. Now just clip into all of the corners along the neckline before pressing the seam and turning the dress right side out and pressing the seam again. Now close up the center back seam of the skirt lining by just pinning the skirt lining right sides together and sewing from the bottom of the zipper stop to the edge of the hem, and then press open. Now moving back to the neckline, you are just going to top stitch between 1/16 and 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the neckline, all the way around the neckline. Now to finish the armscye, you're just going to baste the lining and the shell together, so when you sew the bias tape binding on, your fabrics don't move around. This way they can kind of act as one layer of fabric. Now grab your 1/4 inch bias tape and on one end press the edge inwards 1/2 inch. You're going to place this right sides together at the armhole right at the side seam and pin. We are going to sew along that first indent about 1/4 inch away from the edge on that bias tape all the way around the armscye. When you get to the end, overlap the end to the beginning of the bias tape by about 1/2 inch before backstitching and then clipping off the excess bias tape. Now refold the bias tape in on itself to enclose the seam allowance and give it a good press. Now once you've done that, take the bias tape and fold it inwards towards the lining one additional time, and then press all the way around the armscye. We don't want any of that bias tape being seen from the front of the dress. Now that we've pinned that in place, we can bring it over to the sewing machine and stitch right along the edge of that bias tape to keep it folded towards the lining and to finish off the armscye. And the last step is to hem the dress. If you're using a very loose weave fabric like we are, the side seams are probably going to stretch over time because they're cut on the bias. So a little tip, I like to leave my dress hanging overnight before I hem it, and then either use a hem marker to mark an equidistant length from the ground all the way around the hem, or a ruler and some pins to mark an equidistant amount from the ground to the hem, all the way around the dress. If you don't have a helper, you can put this on your dress form, or you can hang it up on a hanger and do the same thing. So I'm going to mark about 1 1/4 inch lower than what I want the hem to be on the shell to account for seam allowance for a rolled hem. And then on the lining, I'm going to mark about 1 inch higher than I did the shell because I don't want the lining to be seen from the outside of the dress. Now to do a rolled hem, press your hem allowance under 1 inch, so about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge, take your scissors and trim off that seam allowance very, very close to the seam line that you just sewed, and then take the hem, roll it under one more time, press it, and then top stitch that one final time to finish your rolled hem. Do this for both the shell and the lining. And then after that, you are done. All right, so that is how you make this square neck V-waist dress. Let me know what you think. Also, I'm really curious, do you guys like it more when I do beginner patterns or more extravagant advanced patterns? Don't forget that the pattern is the first link down below, and you can use the code PRINCESS for 30% off until tomorrow at midnight. Also, don't forget to subscribe and turn on those notification bells so you don't miss out on pattern discounts in the future. If you like this video, feel free to give me a thumbs up because it's the easiest way to support your favorite creators for free. Also, feel free to follow me on Instagram and TikTok. My handle is Bonollo. And yeah, I think that's everything, so I'll see you next time. Bye!